Hey, DeRacers, due to popular demand, we are now doing a video to talk about very specifically the tools and the terminology that is commonly used in the DeRace space. So starting things off, I want to bring in our public tool where we call it the DeRacers Analytics. You might notice at the top left, it is now up to 0.6. So for the new people here, always make sure to go back to this original link anytime you hear about tool updates and make a copy. The one that you see right there, this is just the public one. Everybody has access to it. But if you go in there and you change anything on it and somebody else changes it, you're now battling over using the same tool. By going to File, make a copy, it's yours. Nobody else can mess with it. And when we do updates with tools, just simply go in there and make a new copy and dump the old one. But each time we make changes, you're going to notice that the number is going to go up. So that way you'll always be able to know if you're outdated or not. All right, so diving into this one, we're going to be working our way through all these terminology, how we have indisputable, win rate, podium rate, races, PPR, the average furlong, standard deviation, and a few other talking points as well. Now, Mr. E, is there anything you want to dive in before we go?
Yeah, I wanted to point out in this version 6 that we have here, one of the new features that was added in is the ability to set a date range. So some people had asked about that. You can actually set a specific date range and it will auto update to see what your horse has run during that period of time. Another thing that we just added in is the standard deviation now divides by the furlong count. So you're actually able to see the standard deviation on that particular distance. Correct, right?
Yep. Oh, yeah. And we also have the min and max reaction for each of the surfaces. And then for anybody that wants to see in the far top right, it also is going to let you know when was the last data update from SMR. And then there's a couple of different time zones if you're really curious to see like how recent was the last rate pulled or race pulled.
That's right.
Okay. All right. So kicking things off, let's start with indisputable. So the very first thing that you're going to see when you're taking a look at a horse here is you're going to see these percentages across the board. Basically, indisputable is looking back historically at the speed of a horse. It doesn't care where it placed. So if the horse ran fast enough that it was a first place pace, it would have gone in credit with indisputable. Same for second and third. Sometimes your horse can get really unlucky. It might get a fourth or fifth place where it ran very fast. And if you don't get those podiums, you could be discouraged and think your horse isn't all that great. But it's a good example to make sure that you know that if you run against a whole bunch of donkeys that run a really slow race and you barely win, indisputable is not going to give you credit because you didn't run very fast. Where on the flip side, if you ran a race full of champions and they all broke the world records and you came in fourth or fifth, but you ran incredibly fast, indisputable will give you credit for that. Ultimately, the higher the number is just an indicator that your horse is fast enough to win.
So let's actually define what we consider to be good here on this sheet. When you see that your indisputable score is red, that's because it's below 18%. Typically, you want to see 18% to be able to have your horse hit some level of profitability. Now, we'll touch on things like cycles and that later, but you're not going to want to dip much below 18% if you're going to consider running your horse on a regular basis. If you get up over 20%, we consider that to be pretty good. And then obviously, if you get up over 24%, that horse is insane and you should be running it all the time. And there will be some flex over time with that indisputable score. So keep an eye on it with each of your horses.
Perfect. And then the last thing about the indisputable, if you ran all first place, your score would be 100%. Second place would be 60. Third would be 30. So it's just a weighted number that just shows you what your average position is based on your pace. So if you fall below that 18%, realistically, you're not running enough fast races to get a payout for what you're putting in for your entry. That's now, right. Win rates, that one's pretty straightforward. It's just taking your total races and divided by how many times you've won first place, and you can see how often that horse wins there. Podium rate, that's just first, second, or third. Nothing too critical with that. Now, beyond that one, we talk about PPR, which is your profit per race. So you could see, is this track an area that you're making profit? And then your average furlong is just going to be breaking down the average pace. Every single time you run through those polls and it shows you how many furlongs you've raced in that, that's going to be what is the average time it takes. So 12.7 seconds, 12.5 seconds, 12.3 seconds. As you run longer and longer, that number gets tighter. And then the last one I think we see on this one between standard deviation is the average population. So that's taking every single horse that has ever ran in the game and is comparing what your horse is. So you could see, is your horse faster than average on those ones? And this gets really important when we toggle over to standard deviation. So let me bring up my screen here. So focusing on standard deviation, the really simple way of describing what this means is how concentrated your horse data set is to its average. So a small standard deviation, like what's shown here, is the horse runs really close in a cluster. And then if you have a horse, let's say, that runs a much wider range, like in the horse in the red, this means the horse has a wide standard deviation, means that every time it runs, it's very far from its average. Now, in this theory, both the green and the red horse, they both have the same average. And this is really important because if you take a look at just your averages and you're comparing two different horses, the horse that has a smaller standard deviation is usually the worst performing horse. And the reason for this is that when we take a look at, let's say, this green horse, you can see the range in which it races. On a low side in this example, it's 12.2 to a high side around 12, 12.6. Now, if we take the red horse, on the low side, it's coming all the way down to the 11.9, and on the high side, upwards to 13. So those 13s hurt really bad, but the fact that it can sneak in so low is critical because when you're going for a first place to win a race, you got to put up some really fast numbers. And so if your horse never deviates from your average and your average is okay, you're just always going to get 5th, 6th, and 7th place. Whereas that horse and the red horse, it might get 12th place regularly, but it's also getting first place. And if you're going for those victories, that's going to help you out on the long term.
Yeah, I think it's really cool when I see horses that have really fast averages that have really high standard deviations. You're going to see incredible indisputable numbers. You're going to see incredible win rates and podium rates. And then right next to it on the very next track, it may have a speed, an average speed that is supposed to win there, right? It might be a few tenths faster than the population average, yet it's just like this horse with the green dots. It can't quite go fast enough. And so it may occasionally get a 3rd place. It's really consistently fast, but it's consistently fast, but not fast enough.
Correct. All right. So then the next thing to talk about is when you get on Discord or you're chatting with other people in this space, you're going to hear people bring up the term cycles. And when they're talking about cycles, it's essentially voodoo in this game. Some people believe in them, some don't. Essentially, the cycle is the wave of good or bad luck. So if you know your horse historically maintains a 10% win rate, and let's say in the last 20 races, it's won a whole bunch more, like 30%, you might hear somebody say your horse is in a really good cycle. It's been winning more than it should. And most likely, luck's going to flip and it's going to start slowing down. The opposite can be said. If your horse, again, with a 10% win rate, the last 20 races has won nothing, somebody might say you're in a really bad cycle, and you could expect that it's going to start picking up speed. These things are really important indicators. If you can somehow predict, even just a little bit, when your cycle might flip, it would be the holy grail of this game. It is near impossible to be able to do so because RNG does a really good job making these such randomization. But when you look at historical logs, like as we're showing here, there is very visible waves, and every horse is different.
Yeah, I think when you look at a horse like this is your horse Skondert, 14-18. This is dirt 7s. We see a real consistent wave, right? There's been 130 races. It spends time up above the average, time down below the average, right? You're able to see that consistent wave, and you know, hey, I'm below or above that. Now, when we look at other surfaces, let's take a look at your synthetic on the same distance. We can see that you've run 430 plus races at this point. You know that you're willing to continue running it, which is fantastic. And we can see that there is waves up and down. Now, we're not saying that you're going to spend exactly 5 races below average and 5 races above average, but you are going to spend time consistently running slower or faster than your average. That's just how normal distribution has to work. You are going to run faster, you're going to run slower. Again, that's how we get your standard deviation as well. You need those on both sides of your average. In this case, your synthetic sevens at the very end here, you've gone through one of the worst stretches ever. And we would suspect that this is going to continue to pull down. And eventually you're going to have a couple of really, really good runs to be able to bring your average back to where it was. It needs to level out over time. That's what standard distribution is. And so we can look at a different surface. We can look at your turf sevens. Again, it's not that there's 5 or 10 races above or 20 races above. It's that you can spend a period of time in a bad cycle or a good cycle. So like you said, when you hear people talking about that, that's what we mean.
Yeah. So if you ever run, let's say 10, 15 races on a specific track and you win an obscene amount of them, and you think you just discovered a god amongst all these donkeys, if that horse then stops winning, you often will hear people say like, oh, something changed, my horse isn't good anymore. And the response might be, you were just born on a really good cycle. And that could be, again, the opposite. I personally had it too, where a brand new horse starts off doing nothing but losses. And right before you're about to give up on a track, it starts delivering. And it's just because, hey, you started with all of your really bad runs. It's important to get through those. And if your strategy is to scattershot training all over every single surface, every single furlong, you run the risk of landing on bad cycles realistically on all of these ones. In my opinion, having a more concentrated so you can get more data sets on a specific track is a better way to be able to tell how fast your horse is, as opposed to just spreading it everywhere, because you don't have necessarily a rigid number to be able to analyze.
Yeah, it's important too that you are not just running 20 to 30 races on a track, right? If you had done that with this horse on your dirt sevens, 25 races in, everything is below your average. You would have been like, oh my gosh, this horse is amazing, right? Like, come to find out, we know Skondert cannot run on dirt. So looking at this, it would have been deceiving. But then you look at the next 20 plus races, they're all above average, and it's evening itself out over time. You would not have known that if you had, let's say in reverse, you had only run 25 bad races out the gate. You may have stopped. There's people out there that will run 10, 15, 20, 30 races and then go, yeah, this horse is done. Like, you can't do it. And there's actually a really important next thing we're going to talk about, that is what you should be looking at as to whether or not you should continue running a particular track.
Perfect. So in the next switch, this one, we're going to go over linear regression. And I think linear regression is one of the most exciting discoveries in this game. And ultimately, when we zoom into what this means, is that these are the hard, cold facts. That dirt consumes more stamina of the horses than synthetic, and turf is the least demanding. So therefore, when you run on all three surfaces, you should, in theory, be faster on turf, and then a little bit slower on synth, and the slowest on dirt. There are some anomalies where some horses are so good on dirt that they can flip that, but for the most part, it goes in that order. Dirt's the slowest, synth's the middle, and turf is the fastest. But then the other thing that is critically important is when you start a race. In this example, we're showing a 14 furlong race. The very, very first furlong, you're starting at a stopped position. So the fact that you're not moving, your first furlong is always your slowest. You have a reaction. Some of you have really bad reactions. So that's time that you're not even moving. So that first furlong as you run it, in this example, it's showing it takes 13 seconds to get out of the way. As you approach the second furlong, you are still getting to your full speed. You're seeing that the speed gets a little bit tighter. But now as you move beyond that and you start to hit your average pace, the further you are getting away from that first furlong that was so bad, it's going to slowly bring your averages down. And that is why when you're watching a distance going from 2 to 15 furlongs, every furlong that you move further, longer and longer, you're going to notice that your average pace gets less. So if you're trying to decide where your horse should run, if you're looking at, let's say, 5, 6, and 7, If you go to 8 and 8 is slower than 7 and slower than the other ones leading up to it, that's usually an indicator that your 8s are not accurate. You should see that the average furlong continues to creep downward all the way towards the end. Sometimes with the last 1 or 2 furlongs, you might see it start to slow down as an indicator that stamina might be wearing off, we believe. But for the most part, after you get past the first 2 furlongs and up to the last 2 furlongs, you should see a very clean line where your horse is going to get faster.
Yep. Wow. Going back to Skondert again, looking at his synthetic line here, you can see what we're talking about. When he jumps out, he runs a 12.69 on the 2s. We would expect that as we move from 2s to 3s to 4s, that number is dropping in average. It has to. That you are spending more time running at your average speed, so you are going to drop that down the longer that race is. That's what we mean when we're talking about linear regression. This has to be dropping over time until you run out of stamina. And that's key. When I talk about with people that I'm discussing this with, when I talk about stamina or stamina loss, and I give you a score for what I think your horse can do with stamina, it is dependent largely on this slowdown. Where do we start to see it squeeze and not get faster and faster and faster? With Skondert, we can see that here around the 7s on synthetic, he's at 12.28. Then he's at 12.28. Then he's at 12.28. And then the 10s here are really fast, but then he slows up on the 11s. So we may have a situation where the 9s need to get a little bit faster, or the 10s may still be an anomaly, even though he's run 113 of them. Mm-hmm. The point is not that you're going to perfectly align, that it's going to be exactly 12.28 and then 12.27 and then 12.26, etc. It's more that it needs to not be an extreme. Correct. If we saw a 12.28 followed by a 12.34, which you see on some horses, if this were to suddenly say 12.34, we know we need to run more often on that track to bring it down and get it into linear alignment.
Well said. So yeah, guys, as you're out there and you're using these tools, especially if you're buying new horses, you're breeding new foals, this is what we use. Like in our racing team, this is one of the most commonly used tools that we assess our horses, and it's very predictable. If you see those anomalies where you see big waves as you look across the linear regression models, you can very clearly pick, this is going to be a track that's going to get pulled down. This is a track that's going to get lifted up, and it does. It does. It just matters of hitting those tracks and getting the quantities up. So just know that when you're out there racing, there is a lot of science behind it. These are the common tools that we use, but you have an enormous community of people that are very happy to help. Just ask some questions, but at least hopefully with this video, you could at least talk with the same terminology that the rest of us do, and that this will make a lot more sense as people give you some insight. Anything else you want to add?
That's perfect. You nailed it.
Right on, guys. We'll see you on the tracks.